What if I told you that this relentless pursuit of knowledge might actually be the exact thing making you more confused?
More anxious, even.
Yes,
Yeah.
more anxious and frankly less capable of actually making decisions.
It's a really jarring thought.
Yeah.
We've been completely conditioned to believe that adding more information always equals greater clarity.
Like if you're confused, just gather more data.
Right. But that is exactly the assumption we're tearing down today.
Hey everyone, welcome to Resilient Inspirations. We're here to share ideas, swap stories, and just see where the conversation takes us. Nothing fancy, just real talk with a spark of inspiration. Let's dive in. I'll hand it over to the crew.
Welcome to the deep dive. I want to start today by talking directly to you.
Yeah, the listener.
Right. Because, well, you're probably a naturally curious person. You devour articles, you buy the books, you've got a queue full of deep dives just like this one to stay informed.
To stay sharp.
Exactly. And you probably pride yourself on it, right? It's part of who you are. But what if I told you that this relentless pursuit of knowledge might actually be the exact thing making you more confused?
More anxious, even.
Yes.
Yeah.
More anxious and frankly less capable of actually making decisions.
It's a really jarring thought.
Yeah.
We've been completely conditioned to believe that adding more information always equals greater clarity.
Like if you're confused, just gather more data.
Right. But that is exactly the assumption we're tearing down today.
So our mission for this deep dive is to unpack a truly eye-opening book. It's called The Learning Paradox: When Knowledge Confuses the Mind by Resilient Inspirations.
A fantastic read.
It really is. And we're going to explore every corner of this text to understand the incredibly fine and often invisible line between being well-informed and being mentally paralyzed.
Because there is a tipping point.
Ah,
And the scary part is most of us have already crossed it without even realizing it.
yeah. So set the stage for us here.
Well, we live in an era where ambient, unfiltered learning is treated almost as a moral obligation. To stop learning, even for like a weekend, is framed as falling behind.
You feel guilty.
Exactly. And what's fascinating here is that human civilization was absolutely built on the careful accumulation of knowledge. I mean, that's how we progress as a species.
Sure.
But today, the sheer velocity, the volume of how information enters our lives has fundamentally changed. It is not a stream anymore. It's a constant pressurized fire hose.
A fire hose straight to the brain.
Right. And that continuous accumulation is literally short-circuiting our working memory.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the authors make a brilliant point right off the bat in chapter 1 about how the very definition of learning has subtly shifted over time.
It's totally morphed.
It used to be about fundamentally understanding the mechanics of the world, but now it's mostly just about keeping pace with it.
You know, they call it learning as identity.
Learning as identity, yes. Being a quote-unquote constant learner has become a personal brand.
Right. It becomes way less about the utility of the knowledge and more about the aesthetics of being a knowledgeable person.
It's like accumulating facts is the equivalent of collecting a bunch of merit badges. But you never actually sew them onto your sash or, use the skills to build a fire.
You just hoard them.
You hoard them in a drawer just so you can tell people you have them. I always think about that professional who subscribes to like 15 different industry newsletters.
Oh, we all know that person.
They spend an hour every single morning aggressively skimming them just so they don't look foolish in the 10 a.m. stand-up meeting. They aren't reading to understand the market.
No, they're reading defensively.
Defensively, that's exactly.
And that defensive posture is heavily driven by social pressure and just pure FOMO. There's a tangible psychological weight to staying informed today.
Oh, absolutely.
If you're in a professional setting or even just a casual dinner party, and you have to admit you haven't read that specific trending business book or that viral long form article,
it feels terrible.
Feels like an intellectual failure. So what's our natural response to that? We engage in performative learning.
Performative learning.
We consume just enough bullet points to signal intelligence to others, but we completely bypass true comprehension. We're essentially just skimming reality.
Skimming reality. That is such a perfect phrase. And honestly, it's terrifying when you think about the cumulative effect of that over years.
It is.
And chapter 2 gets into the actual biological mechanics of what this skimming does to our brains. Now, I know there's a certain type of listener right now, the relentless optimizer.
The biohacker type.
Right. They're listening to this and thinking, look, I just need to train my brain to handle more data. I'm a high performer. I can increase my cognitive load.
I hear that argument all the time. But the authors are incredibly firm on this point. You cannot outtrain your biology.
It's a hard limit.
It's a hardwired limit. Human cognitive capacity has strict biological thresholds. Working memory, which is the part of your brain where you temporarily store and evaluate new ideas, is highly fragile. It's a bottleneck.
So what happens when we blast past that bottleneck?
When you exceed those thresholds with that fire hose of data we mentioned, the brain doesn't just magically adapt and expand its capacity, it panics.
How does that panic actually manifest, though? Because I don't feel like I'm panicking when I'm reading my 7th article of the day. I just feel busy.
Right, but it's a quiet cognitive panic. Your brain compensates for the overflow by skipping depth entirely. It starts generalizing.
Oh, wow.
It fundamentally loses the ability to connect disparate patterns because it's spending all of its energy just trying to hold the new data in place.
So pushing past capacity doesn't make you a super learner.
Not at all. It makes your mind default to a defensive, reactive state where long-term retention absolutely plummets.
And the cost of our daily multitasking just compounds this massive biological penalty, doesn't it?
Exponentially.
Because we live in this noise of unfiltered input. You pivot from a dense newsletter about macroeconomic policy straight into a quick YouTube video about neuroscience, and then right into a thread about startup leadership.
And every single time you make that pivot,
your brain has to toss out the old context.
Yes. It tosses it out and rebuilds the new context from scratch. You end up with this feeling of profound exhaustion at the end of the day.
But when you actually look back at what you learned,
you realize you have a strong grasp of absolutely nothing.
Which brings us directly into the heart of the confusion paradox. The authors make a vital distinction here in chapter 3 that we really need to sit with. Knowledge is not the same as understanding.
It's a crucial difference.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The book lays it out so simply. Knowledge is accumulating dots. Understanding is connecting those dots. But wait, I have to play devil's advocate for a second here. The authors claim that gathering more data can actually obscure foundational principles. Isn't that totally counterintuitive?
It feels wrong, doesn't it?
Yeah. If I'm trying to make a major financial decision or launch a new product, how can having more data points about the market possibly be a bad thing?
Well, it sounds wrong at first glance because we are taught more is always better. But when you just hoard details, marginal cases, and endless exceptions, your brain loses the capacity to weigh them accurately.
That just becomes noise.
Right. The sheer volume of details overwhelms your executive judgment. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is the exact root cause of analysis paralysis. The modern learner is exposed to so many competing methodologies and highly specific viewpoints that they lose the core truth.
So endless comparison basically kills the ability to take action.
Exactly. Your mind just oscillates between competing options, constantly waiting for that one perfect, definitive piece of data that will make the decision entirely risk-free.
But that piece of data doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. And this endless search generates severe decision fatigue. It gets to the point where even micro decisions like what podcast to listen to next become cognitively draining.
And for the listener who thinks they're a bit too smart to fall into this trap, the authors actually call you out specifically in the book. Highly intelligent people are actually far more susceptible to this paradox.
It's a brilliant, slightly tragic observation.
Why does that happen?
Because a highly intelligent mind can see multiple connections. It anticipates a dozen different edge cases, formulates endless what-if scenarios, so it naturally overthinks.
So the very cognitive richness that makes you smart can actually bury you.
If you don't aggressively structure it, yes. Intelligence without discipline and restraint simply exhausts itself. It accelerates the pace of gathering information, but the actual clarity stays completely stagnant.
Okay, so what you're telling me is that my complete inability to pick a product management software for my team last month is actually just a symptom of my staggering genius. I'll be sure to tell my boss that.
I am sure they will be thrilled to hear it.
I'm sure they will.
But jokes aside, it really is the high intelligence curse. You are too smart for your own good, literally. Because you can see every angle, you feel obligated to research every angle.
which naturally leads to the messy emotional drivers behind all of this in chapter 4. Why are we doing this to ourselves?
Yeah.
It's not just pure curiosity, is it?
No, not at all. The text dives deep into the psychology here. It is perfectionism. It's anxiety. It's the illusion of control.
The illusion of control.
Yes, we actively use information consumption as a self-soothing mechanism. We feel uncertain about the economy or our health or our careers, so we read another article hoping it will magically cure that uncertainty.
But it achieves the exact opposite, because every answer you consume invariably spawns 10 new questions.
Precisely. You're trying to use information to regulate your emotional discomfort, but you end up feeding a permanent state of anxiety.
You just get stuck in the loop.
And the mind becomes entirely dependent on external input to feel safe. You mistake the temporary dopamine hit of acquiring a new fact for actual control over your life.
That is a really harsh truth. And honestly, it gets harsher when we look at chapter 5, where they talk about how learning can actually turn toxic.
Toxic learning.
Yeah. The authors point out that reading another book or taking another online course can actually be a highly sophisticated form of procrastination.
It is the ultimate illusion of productivity. You feel like you're moving forward because your mind is engaged. You're taking notes, you're putting in the effort.
But motion is not direction.
Exactly. If that learning is replacing action, it is actively counterproductive. It becomes a psychological shield.
A shield from what?
Failure.
Exactly. As long as you are still in the quote-unquote research phase, as long as you're still gathering data, you're perfectly safe from the risk of actually doing something in the real world and potentially failing.
Wow. Okay, that hits close to home for anyone who's ever bought a domain name and then read 20 books on entrepreneurship instead of just building the actual website.
We've all been there. You buy the book, and your brain gives you the dopamine hit as if you've already mastered the skill, but you're just avoiding reality.
You are.
And this endless stressful cycle of avoiding reality absolutely destroys our biological ability to retain anything, which they cover in chapter 8.
Yes, the biological reality of learning under stress is something we desperately need to talk about. When you're driven by the pressure to keep up, rather than genuine, relaxed curiosity, your cerebral cortex literally shifts into survival mode.
It changes how the brain works.
Entirely. Your attention narrows significantly.
Because it creates that falling behind feeling like a physical threat.
Exactly. Your brain prioritizes managing the perceived threat over integrating new, complex information. Memory consolidation, which is the process of moving something from short-term to long-term memory, is chemically blocked.
Wow.
The authors emphasize this heavily. Calmness is not a luxury, and it's certainly not a sign of laziness. Calmness is a fundamental biological requirement for durable learning.
If you're stressed, you aren't learning.
You're just surviving the information.
Okay, but let me push back on that for a second. If calmness is the absolute requirement, how are we supposed to handle the intense frustration we feel when we're trying to grasp a genuinely difficult, complex topic?
That's a great question.
Because let me tell you, trying to understand quantum computing or advanced macroeconomics makes me incredibly stressed.
Right, and that's a really important distinction to make. The book offers a fantastic reframe for this specific kind of frustration. Confusion and frustration when tackling a hard subject aren't signs of stupidity.
Okay.
And they aren't a threat you need to survive. That feeling is the literal sensation of your old mental models breaking down to make room for new, more accurate ones.
So it's a structural renovation of the brain, basically. It's going to be loud and messy.
Precisely. It's construction work. And this is why the authors present patience not just as a virtue, but as a vital, often completely ignored cognitive skill. You have to learn to tolerate the deep discomfort of not knowing the answer right away.
Tolerating the discomfort. I love that. So what does this all mean for us practically? How do we actually fix this broken system we built for ourselves?
Well, chapters 6 and 7 get into that.
Right. They map out some concrete strategies for regaining cognitive clarity and structuring our learning. It starts with ruthless filtering. We have to identify what they call mental junk, prioritize fiercely, and embrace that mental stillness you just mentioned.
It requires a massive behavioral shift from passive ambient consumption to highly intentional learning. They introduce a really powerful framework for this, building mental containers.
Mental containers, explain that.
Because information without context is overwhelming, we need to create strict conceptual boundaries. You group ideas by theme, by purpose, or by immediate application so the brain knows exactly where to file them.
So instead of just randomly reading a book on leadership and hoping it vaguely makes you a better person someday.
You create a container called Strategies for My Q3 Team Reorganization.
Ah, I see.
Exactly. When you give knowledge a specific actionable function, rather than just letting it take up space in your head, your retention skyrockets. The brain knows why it's holding on to the data.
And it's not just about internal organization either. The text highlights the absolute necessity of rhythm. Meaning, you have to space out your learning so your brain can actually breathe.
Yes, spacing is critical.
And crucially, you have to externalize the knowledge. You cannot hold it all in your biological brain. You have to take notes, draw mind maps, build a system outside of your head to hold the data so your mind is free to actually think rather than just remember.
Now, I think we need to look critically at this solution because there are significant pros and cons to what the authors are proposing here.
Okay, lay them out.
The pro is undeniable. This framework is incredibly powerful for regaining your cognitive agency. If you successfully build these mental containers and strictly filter your inputs, you will drastically reduce burnout and massively increase your decision-making capacity.
There's a con, and I feel like it's a big one.
There is. The con is that the book somewhat underestimates the sheer, exhausting behavioral discipline required to implement this in the modern world.
Yeah.
Implementing strict boundaries and forcing mental resets is exceptionally difficult in a digital economy that is literally engineered by the smartest minds on earth to hijack your attention.
It's an uphill battle.
You're not just making a personal choice. You're fighting against billion-dollar algorithms designed to exploit your psychological vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. The framework is theoretically sound, but executing it requires an almost militant level of personal discipline that, frankly, many people will struggle to maintain while holding down a modern job.
That's a really fair critique. It's simple on paper, but the friction with reality is intense. It's like trying to diet while living inside a bakery.
Exactly.
But let's say you can do it. Let's say you build the discipline, you set up the containers, you fight the algorithms. Where does it actually lead?
That brings us to chapters 9 and 10.
Right, the ultimate application and wisdom. The core thesis they land on is punchy. Knowledge only gains depth through application. Unapplied knowledge is just mental baggage.
Action is the ultimate filter. When you take abstract knowledge and attempt to apply it in messy, unpredictable reality, all the theoretical fluff burns away immediately.
You're left only with what actually works.
Right. Learning without application just creates an inflated sense of confidence that completely collapses the moment it faces real-world friction.
And this leads to my favorite part of the entire text, their brilliant redefinition of what it actually means to be quote-unquote smart today.
It's so vital.
In an age of infinite, instantly accessible information, being smart no longer means knowing the most facts. The guy at the dinner party who can rattle off historical statistics or market trends isn't necessarily the smartest in the room anymore.
No, because a smartphone can do that. Being smart today means exercising ruthless discernment. It is knowing exactly what to completely ignore. It's recognizing the point of diminishing returns, knowing the exact moment where reading one more article won't change your mind. It will just waste an hour of your life.
It takes so much self-awareness.
It does.
Yeah.
Ultimately, it means learning to trust your own judgment over the constant need for external input.
Yes, it's choosing depth over breadth. The book reminds us, quite powerfully, that a few deeply understood, heavily pressure-tested ideas will always outperform a massive library of loosely held, purely theoretical concepts.
Always.
The goal of learning isn't to build a performance of intellect to impress your peers or soothe your anxiety. The goal is to align your knowledge with your actual life.
Now, for that hard-to-convince listener we talked about earlier.
The relentless optimizer.
Right. The one who is still holding on to the idea that they just need a little more data to perfectly optimize their next major life or business decision. Let me deliver the mathematical truth the book builds toward.
Let's hear it.
You will never, ever have complete data.
Oof. Say that again?
You will never have complete data. Waiting for 100% certainty is a mathematical impossibility in a complex world.
That is a tough pill to swallow.
It is. But true confidence is not derived from absolute certainty. It is cultivated by committing to imperfect action and trusting your own capability to handle the feedback that reality gives you.
Right.
If you wait until you feel fully prepared, you will literally wait forever.
That is the ultimate mic drop from this deep dive. So let's look back at the incredible journey we've just taken through the learning paradox. We started by stripping away the allure of constant learning, exposing how it traps us in a false identity and weaponizes our FOMO against us.
We really unpacked that.
We did. We explored the very real, hardwired biological limits of our working memory and how pushing past them leads straight into information overload and analysis paralysis.
The high intelligence curse.
Yes, recognizing the painful irony that highly intelligent people often suffer the most because they overthink without structure, using endless data to self-soothe their anxiety.
We then confronted the harsh reality that reading can easily mutate into procrastination.
Toxic learning.
Right. And that stress biologically destroys our brain's ability to retain what we learn. We realized we have to tolerate the frustration of our mental models breaking down.
But we didn't stay stuck in the problem. We walked through the practical, albeit difficult solutions, filtering the junk, building mental containers, spacing out our learning, and relying on external systems.
The discipline it takes.
And finally, we arrived at the ultimate goal: action over optimization. Choosing to deeply understand a few vital things rather than superficially skimming everything. Choosing actual grounded wisdom over the endless ambient noise of the modern world.
It's a profound shift in perspective. And as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to mull over today. I love these. Let's hear it. We've talked extensively about the hidden dangers of mental excess and the transformative power of application. So consider this. If you were forced, by some bizarre circumstance, to stop consuming any new information, no new books, no new articles, no new newsletters, no new podcasts for the next 30 days.
Wow,
30 days. What existing knowledge currently sitting dormant in your mind would you finally be forced to act upon?
Oh, that is a phenomenal question. What tool are you already holding that you just need to pick up and use? Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. Remember, the things you learn should serve your life, not confuse it. Take a breath, trust your judgment, and go apply what you already know. We'll catch you next time.
And that's a wrap for today's chat. Big thanks to my friends for keeping the conversation flowing, and to you for hanging out with us. If you like this talk, don't forget to share it and hit follow so you won't miss the next one. Take care, stay inspired, and we'll catch up soon.